I'd like to start with a question that we get asked that I think is probably relevant to all of us. We get asked quite often, what is your style? Why do your buildings tend to look differently one from the other? Is that mic okay? Yeah? So it's a question I think is relevant to all of us. And the answer, so indulge me for a couple of minutes before we actually get into some projects. The answer really lies, I think, as a starting point with Giorgio Vasari in the middle of the 16th century. So if you know Giorgio Vasari, he wrote, if you like, the first history of architecture and art, the lives of the most excellent artists, sculptors and architects. He actually included himself amongst them. It's actually written about 150 years of what we would term today as the beginning of the Renaissance. Now, the key aspect of Vasari's book, it's not what we would call architecture history today. It's much more anecdotal, so he's taking particular artists and architects and sculptors, talking about their lives, how they innovated, worked, if you like, apprenticed to some artists, and innovated and developed who they were working for and became, if you like, excellent in their own right. So some of those would have been silversmiths. That was the baptistry gates. For those of you who will spot this, it's not actually a Florentine artist, it's a German, but of that period. So each one of those he defines as innovators in their own right. Their art and architecture is the biography of them themselves, what they've worked for, how they've worked, how long they've worked for particular, been apprenticed for particular masters, if you like. And those are innovations in drawing, and then ultimately the definite development into actual physical form. 200 years later, we have Johann Winkelmann, and this is the period of the Enlightenment, so this is much more rational, and he gives birth to the idea of archaeology as a scientific discipline. So he's mapping the stones that most people would have, on the grand tour, would have sketched, but he's actually mapping them, reconstructing, if you like, those fallen stones, and giving a timeline of when sculptures are excavated as well as architecture is being excavated. So in his first book, it's effectively the history of art in antiquity. His second book actually is where I think, I don't want to call it where it started going wrong, but there's a sort of a worse definition, if you like, of style. Yeah, let's leave it at that. So one of the aspects that he, and he wasn't to know obviously at that time, that he conflated in his second book, which is much more about his personal opinions, as it were, is the idea that Greek is better than Roman, and Greek is better than Roman because ultimately Greeks were more democratic than imperial Romans, and conflating their sense of proportions, their use of those proportions not just in architecture but also in sculpture, with the idea that they're democratic. And you have to remember, he's working at the time of the Enlightenment, so they're really battling the idea of imperialists, monarchists, and trying to develop the idea of being on the humanist line, if you like. As a result of that, I mean, this is obviously what we know today, so he's very much conflating the idea that pure white marble and its beauty is associated with democracy and independence, and obviously, actually, they look like that in the past. Now, the danger. This is where I say maybe it went wrong. The danger of conflating and if you like, studying and then conflating without understanding how things are made. So previously, Vasari would have been talking about the biographies, the methods of making, the 10,000 hours of apprenticeship and learning and innovation. while Winkelmann is much more a broader study, analysis of what's on the ground, and giving it a noun, as it were. So the difference between the verb and the noun. And the danger is, of course, the origins and meanings are actually lost because they're given a different meaning altogether, a different layer of meaning. And the origins there might have been actually the way things were constructed in timber before they were then represented in stone, which then obviously during the 18th century, 19th century leads to a neoclassical architectural style, which is then next generation, depending on where you are, is either Baroque or Beaux-Arts or Gothic Revival, i.e. one style after another, that all of you, including us, are adopting until some point in the mid-20th century, late mid-20th century, where we're thinking of a sort of postmodern period, as it were. Now imagine if that was actually multicolored, it would have a different imperial meaning altogether, wouldn't it? Interestingly, the idea of whiteness transcended the neoclassical into modernism. And I guess our argument is that the danger of that is that we see style as literally a sort of two-dimensional form, whether it's in drawing or photographs, without actually understanding how that built form came about. And as architects, obviously, our vocabulary, our language, every building has a story, if you like, our narrative of the building is ultimately the vocabulary of that is the materials that we work with, whether they're traditional, highly modern and contemporary, whether it's plastics or you name it. All of them have tactile, visual, structural characteristics, and if you understand them and you use them, you can deploy them to tell a particular story. That story might be very traditional and prosaic because of the particular brief you've got, or it might be more poetic ultimately. But I think on the next slide might say why. Now, most people think I'm being disparaging about this sort of product. It's not the product itself, because obviously it's just an inert material. It's ultimately how it's going to be used and why. And there's a number of reasons you should ask why you might use it, because ultimately this is actually more expensive than real bricks. So you might use it in situations where you can't use real bricks. I mean, this is actually the construction method. So you can see there's a superstructure behind there, and they're using timber then to hold up what is effectively a pretend load-bearing structure. And that's really my only criticism of this sort of use, is that this material is pretty much handmade before it's fired in a factory. You could make any pattern you like out of that terracotta. It doesn't have to represent load-bearing, or even in that case, stretcher bond brick. It's a skin, so why not use it as a skin? Use it as a curtain wall. Don't hit it to the ground. Leave it elevated by a meter or so, so it appears of what it is, i.e. a curtain wall, if you like. So I think that takes us to our first built project. That's pretty much the reason we don't use brick very often, is because there's a normal, conventional demand by the contractor that then is working on behalf of the client to say, well, we do brick, we'll tell you exactly how that is going to be formed on as the skin, and it's often the misuse of brick, therefore. And we struggled with the idea that with that particular client, but eventually we persuaded him that actually, given that real bricks are cheaper than the cladding, and ultimately any brick construction today, almost none of it is load-bearing. All it's doing is sitting on the outside of a building as a rain screen. So why actually bond it together, make it look like it's a solid wall, whether it's stretcher or you're pretending it's some sort of other Flemish bond, structural bond, open it up to allow it to be a breathable rain screen. And then in addition, if you allow it, each one of those bricks is made exactly as it was several hundred years ago, same proportion, same strength. Allow it to sit as a load-bearing facade. In other words, it's just taking its own weight all the way up. And this is not to do with necessarily just moral reasons of materials and how they're used. but actually it's much more practical. And if you want to triangulate that for your client, it's actually cheaper, much cheaper. So this building was about 25% cheaper than conventional build of the development next door. Because what you're doing is essentially saying this facade is allowed to move separately from the timber superstructure internally, which means that the timber structure no longer needs brick hangers, which means that the superstructure isn't as heavy as it needs to be, because you can imagine carrying bricks on every floor. It means the foundations aren't as heavy as they need to be normally. And the superstructure can obviously then move independently, meaning that you don't have lots of expansion joints everywhere either. So there are, in addition to, if you like, the traditional, what we used to call honesty to materials, there are actually very fundamental practical reasons once you understand the nature of those materials, not just for your own satisfaction, but actually for, if you like, a client's outcome. So there's the sort of diagram, simple diagram of a CLT load-bearing structure, holds itself up, fair-faced on the interior, and just a skin that drops on top. And you might ask, well, why a pitched roof? Why run the bricks across? We've done a number of exercises on other buildings for other clients where we asked ourselves, if the Victorians and Georgians managed to build mass housing really inexpensively, how on earth can we do it today? And obviously at the end of it all, it still has character. Well, the easiest way of doing that is to drop as many different trades. So here you're dropping your roofer, people put the gutters in, you're dropping your normal window reveal people and all the rest of it. You're allowing basically a certified product to run up waterproofing all the way across and all the way down, and then similarly with the skin of it. So you're dropping trades, you're dropping materials, you're dropping program time on site, as it were. Those of you who can actually see it, are interested, there's the detail. Very simple CLT, all bolted together, a floating floor, everything's left exposed, insulation, vapor barrier, and then very conventionally, a rain screen. So in this case, self-supporting. And then occasionally you're allowed some, if you like, more poetic flourishes. It's housing. So the three projects you're going to look at, they're all different types of housing. This is actually the most inexpensive in terms of its construction. It's just client demand at that time. And the challenge for us was, if we're making it out of these bricks, do we use a grain that is the brick itself, or do we double stack it to make it look heavier, given that it's actually quite a slender facade, and then open it up to sort of give it a, well, one, explain that it's actually a rain screen and not load-bearing, holding up the whole building. And then after that, these balconies, you know, how are they held up? They need to be large enough to put a dining table and house people, but we don't want to run across the facade and block direct light to every window. So alternate them and make them pop out perpendicular. So that's actually, if you can just see there, it's actually a lattice truss that's just bolted back to the timber. And then the challenge is, well, if you make that out of glass or perforated metal, it's got a certain character. Certainly glass, what tends to happen, people will obviously place their belongings there. Before you know, you have bicycles and storage and broken down washing machines, and that's actually, given the slenderness of that facade, after all that careful composition, your elevation really is the sort of detritus, if you like, of our day-to-day living, me included. So what tends to happen, you probably notice that people put rattan screens on their glazed lower balconies especially. So we thought, well, let's predict that, preempt that, and weave that through the lattice structure. That's the interior. The struggle with the interior was persuading the client through their agents that people would actually buy all timber interiors, because agents, you know, they'll always look backwards to what was previously sold, and it's normally conventional white painted plasterboard. We persuaded the client, look, you're saving a huge amount of money by not employing an army of plasterers and buying the capital cost and the plastering itself. If you can't sell any of them, then you've saved 6 months on site, and that capital cost, you can just whitewash it or plaster it if you like. It actually ended up selling for more than the conventional development next door. we've given a budget for some of the ironmongery, so we spent that on specialist locks, which it's not a vast amount of money, but it's part of that philosophy that if there's an overall strategy to the architecture, then some of the tactile, smaller elements need to be a bit more special. Right. On a different scale, a slightly different scale. So that the story there, if you like, the narrative to Barrett's Grove is, if you like, conventional construction, mass housing. This is slightly different, where the budget's slightly better. And here, like all our projects, instead of immediately coming up with an idea, drawing something, the first few weeks are spent surveying, drawing the area, and surveying, if you like, the social history, so layer by layer through the local context. At the top, that's Smithfield there, and that's Clerkenwell close there, and you can see it's a sort of walled enclave. Resolution's not so good, but you can spot it there. That's the first structure that existed in the area, and that's a originally Norman-built nunnery, Augustinian nunnery, that lasted for 500 years until Henry VIII dissolved it, with Duke of Newcastle taking it as his palace. A couple of hundred years later, Oliver Cromwell kicked the family out, built his own palace and seated government there. Until his death, the aristocrats retook the land, demolished his home, built some more housing on it. London boomed, and William Morris actually set up the 20th Century Press, for whom Karl Marx was writing there in that location. It's now the Karl Marx Library, the building next door to us. Lenin also wrote there, but he wrote his Russian language paper there, not William Morris's. And that's our site there. And that's still the center for, if you like, change makers, activism, if you like. We looked at a number of options, and if you're interested in asking why we settled on stone, you can ask me later. But eventually, just so we stay within timeline, I can see Will sort of arching one eyebrow. One of the options was stone. The challenge for us was the stone partly came out of this vast amount of limestone construction, Portland stone construction in London especially, often facing, and just like that question for Barrett's Grove and that detail you saw, the brick, you walk past most stone buildings, most stone-clad buildings today, and you'll see that maybe there's a team of 4 men spending a week actually clipping on stone tiles to a column. And you wonder, well, what on earth has happened to our construction method that we think that's a sensible solution? There must be another way of doing it. So we asked stonemasons we were working with on one of those special staircases that spans from one floor to the other. So we thought, well, they must have an idea, a better idea. And if you don't know, in this country, unfortunately, we don't educate stonemasons to do anything apart from decoration. While in France, they still do a proper long course, and they're educated in construction and structural abilities of stone. And they very quickly told us it's perfectly normal in France to still build in load-bearing stone. In fact, immediately after the war, it was called austerity construction because it was cheaper than concrete and steel. So we knew immediately, yes, structurally possible. Had to work with an engineer and find out, well, why is nobody doing it? Well, engineer thought, from his perspective, it's to do with progressive collapse. So if you take one column out, all the other columns want to drop. Quantity surveyor saying, well, it's just ludicrously expensive. Are you sure about that? Well, I don't know. That's probably why everybody's not doing it. So no one's really asking the questions. You're just making assumptions because we've become normalized after a generation or two of doing it a certain way, conventional forms of construction that are pretty much dictated to us by contractors because they don't know any better either, and they follow their convention and don't really want to deviate from it because of the risks, potential risks. So we pushed with quantity surveyors, with structural engineers and our stonemasons, and we got a price back that was effectively a quarter of what it would be if we, say, built it in brick or clad it in brick or even clad it in stone. In other words, if we put a steel frame or a concrete frame up and then clad it in brick, stone, or even tried to make it out of brick. So it's significantly cheaper, and that's partly in the last 20 years, the extraction of stone has got a lot cheaper, and I'll show you why. That is, if you like, a giant cheese wire with industrial diamonds on it. That slices all the way along the quarry bed, one long block, as it were. And then the previous slide is a chap who's then, this used to be done by hand, is then cutting these holes there that then subdivide the long sausage into smaller sausages, as it were. That's made stone extraction really inexpensive. And occasionally there still has to be some hand tooling. That basically means when you get a block out the quarry, there are three types of finish: the saw cut by the cheese wire, the sedimentary layer, and the drilling. Talk to any stonemason when they come to your offices, and they will give you a spectrum of finishes. Some of that spectrum is called natural. And you ask yourself, what is natural? Well, natural still flame textured, chiseling it, because they get delivered to their yard clean-cut blocks. So it wasn't until we visited the quarry itself, the quarry master told us, these are the natural finishes, and occasionally you'll get ammonite shells and quartz pockets in them. We asked, well, what do you do to this if you send it to the stonemasons? I have to cut it off, crush it for road fill, to give the stonemason his clean block he can then carve in natural. Yeah. So completely perverse again. And even the stonemason didn't realize that you get occasionally this sort of finishes, natural finishes, if you like. So before we have to answer the question: is it structurally possible, and is it then after it's structurally cost possible? How do we dress it? This is just testing how a metal boss will be grouted into the back of a beam, two beams, which is then fixed to, do you see these here, which are already cast into the slab. So this is all on temporary props. So there's a male and female fixing, one's cast into the slab, and the other one then just is grouted into the back of the beams. That's them being lifted into place. So you've got two party walls, our neighbours, and then this exoskeleton of a grid of stone running all the way up the building, which basically means there's no columns inside at all, which is that idea that you have effectively an open plan that one day in the future, in 20 years' time, somebody can come along and completely scrub this layout, and it'll be open plan offices or one large apartment or even subdivided. That is it in this context. I suspect lots of you have seen lots of these photographs before. I never know quite to say when there's just photographs. Just the addition of details like this at ground level. So you remember Barrett's Grove had wicker balconies, special door handles. These are all to do with when you come to a building, you've had the larger concept. As you then step into the next scale, the tactile scale, it's the door handles and the other things you touch and see at close proximity as opposed to the building as a whole. The same here. So here we've got a part-carved Ionic capital in one of the fallen columns, and it's part-carved and fallen because what it's telling you in a sort of English romantic tradition, neoclassical tradition, if you like, it's actually dating the time of the fall of the monasteries. So Renaissance happened quite late in England. So this is the Ionic coming to England at the time of the dissolution of the monasteries. Ionic because the Ionic is associated with female principal goddesses of both Greek and Roman. Principally here referring to Roman because Venus is born from the foaming sea, sits on the shell. And the shell that you normally see associated with that is nowadays associated with St. James or Santiago de Compostela for the Spanish people here, and those of you who've gone on the pilgrimages. And that's our church opposite. Church opposite is a new church, an 18th century church that scrubbed out what was left over of the nunnery, St. Mary's Chapel and the rest of the nunnery. So effectively all it's saying, plus all these various details, it's saying that we might think we're highly contemporary and new, everything we do is new, but actually all we're doing is adopting traditions of the past and perhaps developing them sometimes slightly, sometimes subconsciously, sometimes very consciously, so as in here. These are the interiors of the office and the interiors of the apartments. Biodiverse roofs. Most of you, 90% of you work on buildings with flat roofs, and of course nowadays if you want to build your flat roof you have to have a biodiverse roof, not just a sedum roof. In addition to that, ticking that box, you also have to have water attenuation somewhere, and that's depending on the scale of your roof. Before you know, you've actually built a sub-basement, an underground swimming pool, and pumps are constantly going and taking this water to different parts of the building. We actually thought, we don't want to build another basement just for that. One, it's highly costly, and it doesn't seem like a very sustainable idea. So we worked with our landscape architect and a horticulturalist who came up with the idea that if you plant 4 trees of a certain scale, certain root ball, they will absorb about 80 to 90% of the annual rainfall, London's annual rainfall, giving you a buffer for dry periods and the low-lying greenery, which we thought was actually a far better green roof and biodiverse solution. Okay, so that's taking you from something that's very prosaic in its narrative to something that is still structurally narrative-driven, but having some references to the past, to a scheme where we were really questioning where on earth do we start with this. This is Hyde Park, and that red dot, if you can just about see it, is on Bayswater Road between Inverness Terrace and Queensway. It's really one of the last end of blocks facing the park. That gives you an opportunity to create a mansion house. So again, similarly to the other projects, instead of drawing something immediately, you do some research in the area, and on the corner of Inverness Terrace and Bayswater Road is this oddity for that area, because everything else is pretty much inexpensive, standard stucco, but here's a fine cut stone grand townhouse. And you wonder, you do a bit of research, a bit of digging, and you quickly find it's actually built by the Prince of Wales at the time, later King, Queen Victoria's oldest son, for his mistress, Lily Langtry. And if some of you might know it, but if you don't, go and visit it. It's a hotel now, but the ground floor is completely retained as it was, and at the back of it, which is a bar, I think, is this a mini proscenium arch theatre with some seating, which is clearly where he would then bring his friends and she would perform, because she was a famous actress, musical actress, some of you don't know at the time. The building was built by Muse Davis, they were prominent architects at the time, so they Ritz Hotel, the RAC Club, buildings like that, all across the city as well as outside. Very conventional in terms of you have one bay, which is very repetitive, and then if they did, when you study their buildings, pretty much like most neoclassical buildings, across its breadth, a central piece, 2 wings, and then some changes at either end and the center to define the overall. So we began to draw, if you like, the plan. And all of you, I suspect, if you were given the same brief, would come up with roughly the same plan. Our client, I wouldn't call them expert at the time, but they became more expert as time went on. We're convinced you could get probably 4 or 5 cores in there. Why not? The floor layouts would be a multitude, but actually it makes absolute sense if there are only 2 cores and the layouts are X. Yeah, there's hardly any likelihood that any of you would ultimately come up with any difference. And that's just the nature of, if you like, conventional unit production of housing in terms of whether it's GLA areas or even agents telling you do not go above 65 square meters, 75 square meters, and all the rest of it. There's obviously some fat in there. Given that, we were challenging ourselves, well, how do we drive then ultimately what the building looks like? There are various environmental issues that face the south. Double-decker buses and pedestrians are walking past even, this is first floor level, so there's privacy issues. And we imagined Muse Davis finishing, if you like, the urban block. So we said, well, why don't we make that out of a perforated brass screen that is actually in the fashion of Muse Davis? That gives us our environmental control, cuts down the amount of solar gain into what is otherwise a fully glazed floor layout, as well as dealing with privacy issues, and then perhaps activate some of those to give you some variety and tell us also that actually the floor lines are nothing to do with the Muse Davis period, but they are brutally cutting through what would otherwise be their facade. We took that to planning, and I don't know how many of you sat in front of Robert Davis at the time. He's no longer there, but it's his word was literally, this sort of business. And kind of long story short, he went like that, and it did not happen. Not for us, anyway. Somebody else took it on, and I think they've done a probably fantastic job. I think I've seen a plan, and it is exactly how it's predicted, back to those two cores, and the floor layout's almost identical. About 2 years later, I think we're doing okay for time, yeah. 2 years later, this is the last one, we were invited on a competition on Upper Street in Islington, a bombed out site on what was really a Victorian watered down version of a Palladian facade. So again, you have your central piece, wings and two pavilions, but effectively it's a facade on party wall shop fronts with the shop owners living above. So the end piece is missing. There are 5 other entrants, I think, and we were only given about 2 or 3 weeks. So it was really ideas, immediate ideas. Give us your immediate ideas, and we'll choose from those. And I think they really wanted to take them to planners they already knew and informally have a discussion. We thought it's a short period to do that sort of study and what might occur there, and 5, 6 architects are all going to do something within a certain language parameter that's not too different, as it were. So we thought, actually, we've done this exercise before. Why don't we deploy the idea of bringing back the past? While Bayswater was an imagined past, so it's a complete fiction of how Muse Davis might have finished the rest of their block. This is actually a monument to literally the past. So it's reconstruction of what was there. I say monument because it's not so much saying it was bombed, but if we're recreating and representing the past in that sort of monument tradition, does that give us an opportunity of how we write narratives in the same way that you might write a monument? And obviously, the flaw with most monuments is that narrative is particular to the people erecting that monument, sometimes not in tune with others, even in that generation, let alone several generations later. So we thought it would be interesting if we choose a material that is flawed. So it's effectively telling us it's a flawed narrative right from the outset. So we chose an in situ concrete. I think I'm going to go straight. I mean, this tells you how it's made. So you have a shell that is the cast monument, and then internally it's the inhabitation, the 20th century or 21st century inhabitation, with then our 20th century cutting through the old. But I'm going to. So yeah, sorry, let me go back to how it's made. So there we took a survey. Again, we had to demonstrate, I won't labor the point, but I don't know if there are any QSs here. Same way that we graduate with certain conventions, QSs will also graduate with the cost plan book. And here, it took some time, but the QS eventually came around and understood what we were doing. The cost plan book will tell you substructure, superstructure, external finishes, internal finishes, et cetera, et cetera. Each one of those is a chapter in the cost plan book. Supposing one material actually covers a number of chapters. Well, the problem is no chapter can be 0. So there's always some numbers plugged into that, despite the fact that they should be 0. So it took about 3 or 4 meetings before those chapters were ripped out and the whole thing suddenly made sense to the client, because beforehand, as far as the client was concerned, the whole thing was completely out of budget. But we were sitting there in our client meetings looking down the cost plan saying, why are there internal finishes when the superstructure has already got the full cost of superstructure, below ground, external and internal finishes? Does that make sense? Yeah. So to demonstrate that this was possible, the client was very patient and spent a bit of money on experimenting to demonstrate it would be possible. Jason, who was a project architect at the time, had just graduated from UCL, so he made use of their model shop. They've got a robot, or they did have that time, I'm not sure if they still do, which routed out of a point cloud survey of the opposite building, the opposite wing, routed part of that detail into expanded polystyrene. So this is film industry and car industry and film industry sort of technology. Taking expanded polystyrene, carving what you like into it, finishing it for a set piece or being a mock-up for a car. That was routed. This chap actually ended up becoming the contractor on it. There were 2 contractors making 2 samples just to see whether they could meet the cost as well as the finish. Reinforcement, either side is the polystyrene, and there we learn you have to put quite a lot of, it's gone now, release agent onto the polystyrene, otherwise you'll end up spending all day chipping a small section out. And that's the finish of it. So we were all quite impressed with the final finish. It was very perfect, which made us even more determined that we're going to have to artificially make it fail to talk about a failed narrative, as it were, flawed narrative. So things like this, normally in any specification, contractor would be condemned for that. They'd be hacked off and they'd have to make good. So they'd have to set potentially 15% of the concrete budget aside for coming back and making good those sort of patches. But that's what we wanted. The contractor was actually constantly repairing every time we left because he was convinced we were going to tick him off. But no, he did too many repairs, actually. So in addition to the material itself having lots of flaws and talking about the flawed narrative, we then had to invent flaws. So remember, each one of these pores is a block, a series of blocks. So we took some of these blocks and deliberately, if you like, misdelivered them on the wrong day, the wrong week, upside down, inside out, plus allowed this sort of business. So we had choices of the routing tool. The finest routing tool at the moment will still give you that sort of finish. So it's still quite crude, really. And maybe in 10 years' time, it'll be far, far finer than that. So it partly dates the technology we have. So you can see all sorts of flaws there. Then internally, effectively, it's just B&Q architraves and anaglypta wallpaper on plywood, so not phenolic ply or anything special, and then taken off to give you the actual position of those windows where the architraves and skirtings would have been in the past, and obviously the new floor plates are now intersecting at different levels. Okay, so all the new inhabitation is in this timber. It's a CLT again, just spanning from concrete structure back to the party wall. I think that is about it. There you go. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Amin. That was a superb talk, a real insight, I think, into your thinking and the work of your practice. Do come and join me, please, for some questions. So I'm sure the audience will have questions, but let me kick things off. Obviously, your projects are highly individual, and there's a lot of questioning going into those projects about the materials, the construction techniques, the technologies you're going to use, the history of the place. Do you see them as individual experiments or individual investigations?
They are, yes, I guess so. I think every project's approached that way. I think inevitably, I mean, interestingly, it's 3 housing projects. The purpose of that is that housing is often pretty similar. So I deliberately haven't shown plans because I suspect most of us would plan it exactly the same way. Until you do special one-off houses or special housing, small number of flats, they tend to want to be the same for all sorts of reasons. How you build it and therefore give characters to that particular solution, that particular site is it's up to us as individuals to do the research, to do that digging around in that context to see whether it begins to give you reasons for choosing particular materials that, if before they crystallize a solution, are orbiting your mind in terms of what, for structural purposes, cost purposes, as well as aesthetic purposes, before they begin to sort of crystallize, as it were. So inevitably, the idea is that there is some specific solution to particular sites. My worry is that we haven't actually built vast amounts, so there's already a number of sites in the same way as housing would, plans would generate this roughly the same solution on different sites. You really can see that potentially some other sites are actually almost calling for the same solution. And we're thinking, well, there's nothing wrong with repeating the same idea, because actually the first time you've done it, it is an experiment. You've learned quite a lot. And you also learn that there was a particular solution that might have given it a different character, and maybe that's what you exploit on the next project. How many you go before it just becomes an iterative repetition.
But repetition would seem to be out of the question, given the history of each individual area, wouldn't it? Unless you're building a project right next to another.
I mean, I'm not sure whether we're all that. It's nice to think we're all absolutely individuals and we're completely different from everybody else. And areas are completely different, the sites are completely different, briefs are completely, but they're not. So there's a vast amount of similarity, so repetition will occur. Yeah. I think there's a point when repetition in any similar solution where it becomes almost a parody of a previous iteration. Yeah. At that point, the value is lost.
And is some of this experimentation, this questioning, a reflection of your own personality?
There's bound to be some, isn't there? That you want to, you're driven.
And if so, where does that come from?
Well,
I mean, you seem to approach things almost like, speaking as a journalist, that's the sort of way I look at things. I'm always questioning things. And not many architects, I would suggest, do go into that deep level of questioning. I've offended the entire room, sorry about that. But, I'm not saying architects aren't questioning, but the level of your questioning is perhaps setting you apart.
It's an interesting topic because if you think maybe 150 years ago, so when vast amounts of England, UK was being built, especially London as well, were there that many titled architects? There's vast amounts of building going on, so the builders who are financing, the developers, as well as, if you like, their internal architects, because really most of it was pattern book construction, but still needing solutions for on the ground conditions. And I would suggest that most of what we do is pretty much still that. So a vast proportion of what we actually build is housing and offices, commercially orientated. So to some degree, that mass housing, that mass production is inevitable. There are special occasions, whether the public institutional buildings that require special results. Mm-hmm. And maybe, yes, you're right, there's a sort of resistance where we have worked in conditions where you must reproduce the mass conventional solution. And you ask yourself, why should you resist that? Well, who's going to benefit apart from maybe your own sanity? but your client isn't interested in your sanity, really. Well, it's got to benefit ultimately the client and the users, and if you can therefore triangulate and seek their satisfaction, you're going to make everyone happy in that, and that's hence, for instance, the most prosaic. Barrett's Grove is an example of that.
Any questions from the floor at this point? Yes, gentleman at the front.
Question about your last project.
If you could say who, if you don't mind saying who you are.
Oh, hi. My name's George.
Hi, George.
George Clark, but not the guy from Channel 4.
Not the other George Clark.
So about your last project, how was the reception when you took this scheme to the planners? Because if you were to have approached it with just a straight rebuild as it was before, I'm sure that would have been fine. But if you're looking at it the way you have, and in terms of maybe approaching it from sort of looking in conservation way and bringing in modern interventions to that building, that would kind of generally be frowned upon to kind of move away from as it was the first time.
You
That
mean
makes sense.
who would frown on it?
Well, if it was standing and built, and you were coming in as a renovation and trying to, put all the windows in and make all these changes, you generally wouldn't get away with it.
You would get away with it.
I don't think you would if it was, say, it was a listed
Oh,
building.
you mean if it? Yeah, of course not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, coming in with that approach to rebuilding something but changing it dramatically.
So how was it received by whoever, planners as well as? Client was receptive because they thought it was actually maybe, they liked the idea of bringing back what was there, somehow a representation of that past. They also could see potentially the advantages of going to a planning department telling them you're reconstructing the old, even if it was clearly not in a traditional construction method. So reasonably well, we won the competition, so I guess reasonably well received by the client. And then similarly by planners. Interestingly enough, and this is a sort of error I guess all of us have to avoid, we initially wanted to cast it in bronze, but the conservation officer at the time is much more conventional in terms of reading the policy book, and said there's no bronze in the conservation area. It says on the policy you must use materials that are common in the area. And in the precedence of who's done this sort of thing before, obviously there's Rachel Whiteread, I don't know if you know Doho So, Korean artist, who we were especially referencing for the bronze, as it were. And we also used Dina and Edward Francois. And of course, in that meeting, the conservation officer is flicking the pages and says, well, I don't want the bronze because there's no bronze in this area. I want that one. So then the challenge is, well, okay, client wants to execute this project and we want to potentially execute it to our satisfaction. So there's the challenge, Why would ours be different? Well, it inevitably will be anyway, but I'm not sure if that answers your question. Ultimately, it was well received, despite the initial challenges with another material.
And obviously, you're in the middle of a big challenge over Clerkenwell Close. I'm sure most of the audience know about that, and the council's intention to demolish, which is very fiercely resisted by the architectural community, who I know have given you a lot of support. What's it been like to be in the centre of that row? I mean, it must be quite surreal at times, I imagine, with the paparazzi and and also it's your family. You've got a young family living there, so that must be hard. Yeah,
it is. It's very hard.
Are Are you heartened by the support that you've had
obviously,
from,
very
from
heartened.
the
Very
profession?
it helps. It helps a great deal. It helps a great deal. But it comes back to that initial set of slides that I put up, where that initial set of slides came about because I think maybe about 5 years ago we were asked to contribute towards a series of debates that Future Cities, Institute of Ideas, and others were having, and they were debates which I thought had gone. You know, they're long dead. Why are we still debating them? And they're called style wars. You know, specifically about architectural styles, and there are people literally promoting different periods. So whether it's neoclassical or the classical language. High tech, metabolism, Japanese metabolism, and there are people promoting this stuff. Yeah. So we were asked to contribute, and our decision was actually it should be no style. It's titled No Style. We're living in a postmodern period, whether you like it or not. It's a fact. We're living in a postmodern period where we're all given our own freedoms. With those freedoms come a vast amount of responsibility. You have to educate yourself. You can walk around in if you like, sticking to architecture without digressing to people's personalities and sense of dress or anything else, or personal philosophies. There's a responsibility to actually understand what you're working with. Hence my challenge that for many generations, probably about 200 years, we've fallen into the trap of following styles. Being educated, as soon as we enter a school of architecture, this is the predominant style, this is what you'll be educated in. If we go back generation by generation, whether it's modernism, Gothic revival, the Beaux-Arts, neoclassicism, etc. And obviously every generation challenges the past, and a new style, if you like, is born by those people who might have innovated it, but then there's suddenly a whole sea of conventional education which says follow it. And that's because art history, opinion makers, critics, journalists, because our sort of motivation to categorize and give meaning to things tends towards that. My suggestion is that our debate was that actually if you look at Vasari, so 200 years prior to Winkelmann, so for those 200 years, it was all about individuals actually mastering what they're working with, understanding their particular style, so that's a personal biography, as you were suggesting earlier. That might be to do with materials and innovation in particular materials you're working with. It might be an idea, a particular idea, so entirely theoretical. But all those aren't necessarily just trapped towards those individuals, but they can disseminate and change. That doesn't necessarily mean universal change, but influence. And to answer your question, I think for at least the 2 generations, we've lost that as architects, and I'm not saying any of us here are guilty of that, but there's plenty of architecture you can walk past where even the literacy of if you're using load-bearing materials to appear as if they're load-bearing, so you've got a steel frame, a concrete frame, or using brick to make it look like a solid building because everybody likes brick and it looks solid and fits in and all the rest of it, but somehow the alignment of that brick, how that brick is then supported over a window or a door opening, is not thought about consciously, where someone's saying, well, actually, I don't want a lintel there, I don't want to express a lintel. It's just an assumption. I will render this image, whether it's by hand drawing or CAD, in a brick wash. Here are some openings. It hasn't even occurred to me that there might have been a soldier course, or flat or arched lintel, or even a steel or stone or whatever. All these things are still possible to do because they are the sort of fundamental structural that then led to the style solutions. And it's the fact that we've lost it, that we create so much of it. If we don't have that literacy, then how do you expect members of the public, who then become councillors, who then become conservation officers, or ministers in government?
It's a superficial understanding. understanding of
It's
where
well,
style
it's an inevitable misunderstanding of the etymology of architecture, which is as a result of, dare I say, a great deal of literacy in architects, because ultimately when people complain about narratives, what is a narrative in a building? All buildings have a narrative. Most commercial buildings are, the narrative fundamentally is make me profit, but it has to be built. Yeah. So there's a structural narrative. If there's an illiteracy in that narrative, in the appearance of that building, then we're speaking without literacy to people. So how on earth are they going to understand anything? So inevitably, you have councillors and conservation officers and ministers potentially not understanding the gobbledygook that we're all speaking. Yeah. So it's a requirement to become self-literate, and then because all of us can understand it. As soon as you use certain types of materials in a certain way, all of us already have that education to understand. Immediately read a building and understand how it's made, why it's made, and what it's telling us.
But like you said, it's the categorization and the crude sort of categorization that people get into.
Yeah.
Any more questions from the audience, please? We've got time for one or two more. Yes. If you, there is a mic coming, so if you could just briefly say who you are, please. Thanks.
Jack Hughes. You referenced the fact that you had a relatively small built portfolio, and it's for an architect a practice that is obviously trying to push building conventions in a way that's obviously understandable, especially in housing. And as I guess more recently, you've managed to build a few projects as practice profile has risen. But I think especially with the way in which London architecture seems to follow the client's pocket of being relatively generic, did you find towards the earlier on that it was very difficult to actually convince people that they needed to invest in both financially and in terms of their time and experimentation with building one-to-one moquettes of things? And that I can imagine that you probably have a whole ream of developers just saying, no, get out of it. We're not doing this.
Well, this one, obviously, the client is running a special design competition and absolutely interested in getting a certain type of result. That's most expensive of the three in terms of pound per square meter. So they have a special ambition. The conventional ones, so Barrett's Grove and even Clerkenwell, is actually conventional in terms of construction methodology. It's just that we've put it together in a different way. And ultimately, it's pound per square meter cost. However, even if we persuade clients that stone, first of all, if they're interested, it's 10% of the carbon footprint of using steel or concrete. It's 25% cheaper, should be faster. If the client buys into that, he has to tender it. And that's where you then hit the next stumble. So your first stumble is the quantity surveyor and the client, because ultimately the quantity surveyor is key nowadays with the project manager, because architects are no longer trusted to understand the costs. And really, as an architect, if your title is still team leader, you need to be a team leader, and you need to understand your client's criteria. And as you say, conventional housing or commercial building, it's actually not that complex. It's a very simple bank mathematical equation of the profits they require, the costs they're going to buy the land for, is a product of how much it's going to cost and how much profit they're going to make at the end of it. So once you understand that, and you manage to convince your client that you've brought the construction costs down, so their profit might be more because they've already bought the land, for instance, they will run with that. But the next challenge is then the contractor. And the problem is most contractors, I've done this type of construction before, but I've had to do the following with it, and therefore I'll add an extra 20%, and suddenly your saving vanishes. So you really have to persuade contractors. There is another method, which is you also become construction manager, and then you subcontract all the various elements, and you're effectively asking the client to take the risk for those. So it's hard. So and it's slowly happening. So for instance, CLT is perfectly normal nowadays, but allowing it to be fair face finish for acoustic and fire reasons has been resisted for mostly acoustic and fire reasons, but also under the guise that actually conventionally nobody wants to buy exposed timber. But if you can meet those fire and acoustic reasons and convince your client that it can sell, then they've saved 25% in construction, and that's normally quite a persuasive argument.
It would be possible to, I mean, all of the 3 projects are in London. I know you did CLT on the project on Broadway Market before Barrett's Grove, I think. Do you think it is something that can be successful in London, but actually outside would be a lot trickier?
It makes total sense to make buildings out of CLT. Extremely fast to construct. I mean, most of the time it doesn't take more than 2-3 weeks to put up that scale of building. Eight working days, I think, has been the fastest.
Not specifically CLT, but more just the approach to having such a bespoke construction method.
Well, that's the idea. It's bespoke at the moment, but it becomes conventional. Yeah, more conventional. Yeah.
Is that an ambition to build at a much greater scale or work with a volume house builder?
Well, the stone version, somebody's asked us, we've got planning approval and I think it's on site now. A sort of equivalent in a different type of stone, finished differently, but load bearing, 10 stories tall, in Camden. So yeah, I think there's I won't mention who, but a large developer came to see us.
I do.
We took them around Barrett's Grove, told them the criteria to make sure this is how you make a successful CLT building. Coming back to this team leader business, you need to get your team around that table. So it's acoustic engineer, fire engineer, approved inspector. They need to be sitting around that table all the time because then they then input and tell you how to make sure that all these things can happen. So we did all that, but he's using another architect to build. The thing about design and build, it's got a bad name because it's opportunity. The spectrum of doing nothing and handing over one piece of paper which says build me 20 flats is perfectly possible in a design and build contract. At the other end, you can do the full traditional contractual information and hand that over. But obviously, it's less advantageous for the contractor because the one piece of paper gives them all the opportunities to buy the cheapest possible materials, make it in pink where you might have envisaged it to be in blue because you haven't specified it. Doesn't really matter. That's your specification. While the other one is absolutely every single screw, nut and bolt. But still, it's still design and build to time and budget. So as long as that information is in there, it's a legal document, and the client's willing to police it, and you're willing to police it, then there's no reason why you can't deliver what you want.
Okay, well, it's nearly time to wrap up, but maybe time for just one quick question, if anyone has one. Yes, gentleman towards the back, thank you.
Chris Boyce. Do you think what happened to you, or what is happening to you in Clerkenwell at the moment, will turn out to be a magnificent piece of accidental PR?
Somebody else asked me that. Somebody else asked me that. Yeah, you know, secretly you must be enjoying the. No, I might be grinning about it now, but inside there's a crying, crushed, whimpering person.
You will win.
It's horrendous.
Eventually. You will win eventually.
Well, I hope so, yeah, but still, at the bottom of the piece of paper it says demolish. Yeah, it's absurd. It's as absurd as it is. Yeah, it's completely absurd.
They've already pulled down one of the columns, haven't they? I saw it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much to. Didn't mean to end on such a flippant note, but thank you very much to our host tonight, Roca, who supported this event, and thank you so much to Amin. Please put your hands together, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.